They say that on the night on which he was born, something like a helmet appeared in the sky. It seemed to flutter there in the air, and then it crashed into the middle of the plain and was scattered over the ground. Then also live coals and fire flew about like glowing ashes and collected so that they filled all the plain and were throughout the city. This is the Timur Podcast. "684 years. 684 years ago to this very day, a boy was born. The parents would give this baby a name that translates to iron or of iron, and history remembers this name as Tamerlane or Timur or Timur or simply Timur. And on April 9th, or April 8th in some sources, but on April 9th, 1336, exactly 684 years ago, this marks the traditionally accepted birthday of this man. My friends, we have finally made it. We have finally arrived to the real first chapter of this story. Welcome to the Timur Podcast. Whether you've been with me since day one, or you're just joining us now, we're glad you're here. This is a podcast that covers the life, conquests, and character of the infamous Timur. And our goals are to understand who he was, what he did, how he did it, and why does it even matter? The past 10 episodes or so, we've been setting the stage, looking at the context of Timur's arrival, and running over the pre-Timur history of this time period. To sum it up in a single sentence, we looked at Genghis Khan, the three successor great Khans, and the formation of the mighty Mongol Empire. Then we saw how the empire split into four parts, the four Khanates, and how each Khanate fared differently and took on different distinctions, lives, and characteristics of their own. All four of these Khanates matter to us and to the story of Timur, but it is the centermost of the four, the Chagatai Khanate, that we are primarily concerned with, as it is within this region today that Timur will be born. Now, that was actually 3 sentences instead of a single sentence, which means that, yes, I did lie to you. And speaking of me lying to you, it turns out I've actually done that a few times. Not on purpose, of course, but I have lied. I told you that this episode would be out long ago, and that, of course, did not happen. I owe you an explanation for this, and so I will explain things a bit at the end of this episode, but not now because I want to get to the story as soon as possible. But guess what? That's not the only lie I've told you. Welcome to the Timur Podcast, where I just go on and on and on about how untrustworthy I am. But here's the deal. I am bound to make mistakes with the history. It just happens. So preparing for today's material, I came across 2 mistakes that I made in previous episodes. Now, before I correct these mistakes, if you're just dying to get to the birth of Timur without any historical context or mistake correction, I understand. So somebody from the future will be with us shortly to tell you what time to jump to in this episode to just get straight to Timur's birth. This is that somebody from the future. If you want to jump straight to Timur's birth, hop on over to 29 minutes and 30 seconds-ish. Somewhere around there, maybe. Anyway, now that we've gotten rid of them, back to the mistakes. First of all, in the last episode I published, the sort of summary episode, we were reviewing the various leaders of the Mongol Empire, and when I came to the Queen Regent Ogul-Hamish, widow of Guyuk Khan, I mentioned how her reign was weakened by her affiliation with Fatima. Fatima was a Persian Muslim woman carried back to Mongolia after Genghis's conquest of Persia, and Fatima eventually made her way into the court of Ogul-Hamish. The two became very close. All the aristocracy who opposed Ogul-Hamish said that Fatima was a witch, and so Fatima was eventually executed because she was a witch, but probably actually to undermine the rule and mental well-being of the Queen Regent, Ogul-Hamish. Except that's not what happened. Well, it is what happened, but not to Ogul-Hamish. No, it happened to Ogul-Hamish's mother-in-law, the mother of Guyuk Khan, the widow of Ogadai Khan, Queen Regent Toragin. The first queen regent to hold the reins of the empire, actually. Now, those events I just described did play out that way, but it was to Torrigen and not to Ogil-Hamish. A minor mistake, and one that doesn't really affect the story of Timur too much, but I noticed it bothered me, I was really upset, so I had to correct it. The second mistake I made, and this is something that directly affects the story of Timur, is what I said about Khan Kazan ibn Yasaur, or simply Khan Kazan. It's confusing, these names are driving me nuts, but Kazan. So I made this mistake twice, both in the episode on the Chagatai Khanate and in the summary episode 2. It's embarrassing, I know, but here's what I did. I mentioned how the Chagatai Khanate collapsed and split into two pieces sometime in the 1340s. This is all correct. The Khanate split into two pieces, Transoxiana in the west and Mogulistan in the east. But then I said that a guy by the name of Kazan became the ruler or Khan of the western half, and the western half only. Not what happened. Khan Kazan was the Khan of both halves. He was the last Chagatai Khan before the Khanate split in two. So Khan Kazan ruled the Chagatai Khanate, which included both halves, Transoxiana and Mogulistan, and then for reasons that we will talk about today, Khan Kazan was murdered in 1346 or 1347, and it was this murder that caused the two halves to split apart. Well, there were a bunch of other reasons too, but this was kind of what lit the spark. So that was a big whoops on my part, but I'm glad I caught it because it was pretty important. Anyway, now that we have the housekeeping done, here's what we're going to talk about today. We will begin by discussing the geography, culture, and politics of Transoxiana, that is the western portion of the Chagatai Khanate. Then we will take a look at Khan Kazan, his murder, the split of the Khanates into two halves, and the immediate political fallout in Transoxiana. And finally, amidst all of this chaos and war and intrigue and violence, a baby will be born who will change the world forever. So let's begin. The year is, well, I left us at the year 1343 last episode, I think, but let's just say we're in the mid-1300s, okay? So the Mongol Empire has fractured into its four respective parts, the four Khanates. And one of these Khanates, the Chagatai Khanate, positioned in what's today Western China, Western Mongolia, Eastern Kazakhstan, and parts of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, well, this Chagatai Khanate will soon split into two parts. And the eastern half, the eastern part of this, is typically referred to as Mogulistan, and the western half as either the Chagatai Ulus or simply Transoxiana. And I will be referring to it as Transoxiana. And both of these halves, although being united as a Khanate, both exhibit some differences. The people of Mogulistan in the east, for the most part, they are mostly nomadic, mostly still either pagan or Buddhist or Nestorian Christian. Meanwhile, the people of Transoxiana are also greatly nomadic, sure, but there also exist many settled peoples living on farmland or especially in several of the powerful cities that dot the landscape, such as the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. Also, in contrast, the settled peoples are mostly Islamic, and Islam is also the fastest growing faith among the nomadic peoples here as well. But politically speaking at least, the two halves are actually kind of similar. On the macro scale, if you will, both regions are, of course, united under the same banner of the Chagatai Khanate. For now. And Khan Kazan, that guy who I lied to you about in the last two episodes, well, he is the last ruler of a united Chagatai Khanate. So on the macro level, both Transoxiana in the west and Mogulistan in the east are similar enough, right? Well, on the micro level, that is to say the regional politics within both of these regions, well, the politics are again still pretty similar. Dozens of tribes, some more powerful than others, live off the land in both of these provinces. Now, pre-Chagatai Khanate collapse, these many tribes were generally more or less kept in line by whoever the Khan was, and this went about as well as could be expected. If the Khan was an effective leader and had enough support of the men behind him, he would sometimes be allowed to rule. But as we saw 2 episodes ago when we talked about the history of the Chagatai Khanate, this was hard to do. And if a Khan was in charge who wasn't a great leader or who didn't have enough support, at best he'd be removed and at worst he'd be killed. And the more time that passed since Genghis Khan and his 4 sons, attributes turned to ideals, and ideals turned into myths as fewer and fewer Khans could actually keep the throne of the Chagatai Khanate with their head intact. So yeah, it's only a matter of time until this whole system just comes crashing down. And we'll get to how it did come about that, but first let's take a break to look at the politics of the realm post-collapse, or after the split. After the collapse of the Chagatai Khanate, you still had dozens of powerful tribes living in the lands. They didn't disappear, of course. And these tribes may, at times, unite in name under some sort of puppet Khan. But for the most part, they remain largely independent, often at war with each other, joining together in confederations only for political gain or to fight off some outside threat. So although both Transoxiana and Mogulistan would technically become their own separate kingdoms, because of the heavy decentralization, they should more accurately be called confederations. Now, I've been throwing these names around Transoxiana and Mogulistan, but we know that there are parts of the Chagatai Khanate, we know that there are a lot of tribes living here, but what are they? Well, next week we will take a look at Mogulistan, but right now let's look at Transoxiana. Transoxiana is actually the geographical name for the region, even though I've kind of been using it as a political name as well. But Transoxiana is the English name for what the Arabs dubbed Mawarnar, or something similar to that. Forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, but Mawarnar means the land beyond the river. For Transoxiana is a corridor of land about 300 miles long that runs between the river Amu Darya in the south and Sur Darya in the north, or as they're classically called, the Oxus River and the Jakartes River. Because of these two powerful rivers, Transoxiana has been sort of an eastern fertile crescent for thousands of years. And like the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris or around the Nile, Transoxiana was surrounded by dangerous lands. To the east and south rose the menacing Hindu Kush Mountains, inhabited by fierce Afghan warbands. To the west extended the seemingly endless Karakum Desert, which means desert of the red sands. And to the north, past the Jakartes River, there began the seemingly never-ending steppe, sometimes referred to as the land of hunger by the settled folk. But despite these harsh surroundings, the people of Transoxiana have long flourished. It became a vital province to the various Persian empires, and it was here on the Jakartes River where Alexander the Great defeated the powerful Saka people in one of his more famous battles and marked the furthest east the Macedonian banner would ever fly. After this time period, Transoxiana would remain an important district to the Parthian Empire, the Sassanids, and the various Islamic empires and sultanates that took over. But throughout all the ages, despite often being conquered by invaders, Transoxiana always remained important, and this was largely due to the Silk Road, the famous road running from Constantinople in Russia and Egypt in the west, all the way to China in the east. And a lot of these various parts of the Silk Road converge in Transoxiana, bringing with them all sorts of wealth and luxuries. Thus, Transoxiana has long been synonymous with great wealth, fantastic cities, and impressive culture. But now, by the mid-14th century, Transoxiana is in turmoil. The bloody invasion of Genghis Khan a century or so before, the countless Mongol civil wars, and of course the Black Death, turned this land and its people into shadows of what had once been. Decades of abusive or inept Khans steadily growing weaker, coupled with the fact that the tribes in the area steadily grew stronger and more influential, meant that the land was part confederacy, part Khanate, and maybe even part anarchy to some extent. A man could only rule this land if he had the approval of at least most of the tribes. In Transoxiana, there were many of these tribes, but most important were the 4 old tribes. A century earlier, Genghis Khan had conquered this area and had given certain clans and families of his warriors parts of the conquered land as new lands of their own. That was part of the important deal. The key to getting these nomadic soldiers to obey you was giving them something in return. You fight for me, I will give you more land, stuff, and I'll give you more stuff and slaves than you can handle. And these were some of the lands handed over to some of Genghis's followers. Over time, these Mongols intermarried and intermingled with the local Turkish peoples, making these tribes sort of an ethnic mix of Turks and Mongols, but maintaining their honorable line of duty and honor back to the days of the mightiest of men, Genghis Khan. For it is he whom they had served so long ago, and it is from his hand that they originally came to this land. The four main tribes of this category were the Arlat tribe, the Suldus, the Jaligir, and the Barlas. And I'm probably saying those wrong. Again, I'm doing the best I can, but I apologize. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but it is from the Barlas tribe that Timur will be born, so remember that name. But in addition to the four old tribes, there were also two newer tribes who had arrived during the various civil wars between the Mongol Khanates, so much like the older foreign origin, but just newer. And these tribes were the Yasaur, or the Yasauri tribe, and the Apardi. And then, in addition to these tribes, you had countless smaller clans. You had some local emirs, usually Turkish men, ruling over independent cities or cities directly governed by the head of one of the tribes nearby. And then there were some of the indigenous Turkish tribes as well. Are you confused yet? Well, just hang on. It may be tempting to view these tribes as sort of giant families, groups of individuals who are somewhat self-contained, who are fiercely loyal to the other tribesmen, and fiercely protective to the tribe body and their land. This was not the case here, not at all. Movement of a tribe member from one tribe to another tribe was not just normal, it was completely commonplace. If the leader of your tribe wasn't treating you how you wanted, you were fine to just leave and join another tribe that better suited you. Now, of course, this really only worked for those who were in the upper classes, and almost certainly only for men, but all that to say, tribe membership was in a constant fluid state. Further, tribe leadership was not monarchical. There was no divine mandate behind the tribe leader like there was for the European kings or the Chinese emperors of the time. If you were a bad leader, your people would remove you or run you out. And then you'd be replaced. You could be replaced with, say, your brother or your son or your nephew or uncle or some other guy from your family. But there were also other families within the tribe who also had a host of men the people could pick from. I might have said that in a confusing way, so let me just repeat myself real quick. Within a tribe, there was no royal family like we might see in England or France at this time. No, there were the old families who had been in this tribe since the days Genghis first gave them the land, maybe even somehow loosely related to Genghis or one of his other sons. One of these families might hold power for a while, but you can bet that the rival families were constantly trying to get one of their boys in charge of things. So within these tribes, there's just this continual circle of competition, replacement, and thus, in an odd way, sort of also accountability. You only get to rule if you're good for your tribe. But like I said just a few minutes ago, this is a land of many tribes, and these tribes are rubbing up against each other. There are old rivalries, there's that old pasture that you and your tribe think is yours, but me and my tribe know you're wrong, blah blah blah. But here's the interesting thing. Let's go back to those old aristocratic families within a tribe. Well, let's say that you're the leader of one of these families, but you're not in charge of the tribe, even though you want to be. Now, I so happen to be the leader of a neighboring tribe, and your tribe and my tribe don't really get along, but you come to me and say, hey, if you help establish me and my family as the one in charge of my people, well, we'll give your tribe some of our land, and both of our peoples can be better off for it. So you've got all sorts of politics between the various families, between the various tribes, right? And this was so much the case that with the conflicts we do see at Transoxiana this time, the battles were not split down tribal lines, but often down family lines, so you'd have tribal members of the same tribe taking different sides. But hold on to your hats, which are quite beautiful by the way, because remember that there are also quite a few settled peoples living in this area, particularly in the few dozen cities built near or on the two rivers. How do these people fit in? Well, to simplify it a lot, they're basically pawns or tokens owned by the more powerful tribes. Sometimes the tribe may directly rule over a city, sometimes the tribal leader might have a home or a set of businesses within the city with some sort of understanding with the city governor, and sometimes, although rarely, but sometimes you would have a city that was autonomous, but with some sort of protectorate agreement with whatever powerful tribe happened to be the nearest. But the good news is that relations between the settled and nomadic peoples here were improving, because it was only a few decades prior when these tribes were sacking their own cities just to make a quick dollar. But those days were thankfully slowly coming to a close, it seems like, and the nomadic and settled peoples were trading more, they were worshipping together more, intermarrying more, fighting alongside one another more, and most importantly perhaps, sharing the same faith more and more, that being Islam. And this change follows the pattern that all four of the Khanates followed. Although the Mongols were in control of all of these different lands and peoples, the Mongols themselves soon found themselves as ethnic, religious, and cultural minorities, and as time went on, they began to reflect the locals more and more. In the Golden Horde, the Mongols slowly began to be more and more Turkish or Russian culturally, and Islamic or Orthodox religiously. In the Yuan dynasty, as seen with Kublai Khan, the Mongols there grew increasingly Chinese and Buddhist in how they governed and how they lived. In the Ilkhanate, the Mongols there became more and more Persian and Islamic, and in the Chagatai Khanate, the Mongols were slowly but surely Turkified. But anyway, there's one more aspect to the political scene of Transoxiana at this point in time, and that is, although it was mostly this confederacy, there was a Khan, a ruler who in name had control of the tribe's cities and lands. In practice, though, this varied wildly depending on the leadership capabilities and wisdom and skills of whatever man was claiming to be the head honcho. So now that we've kind of looked at the intricate politics within Transoxiana, we can look at the history of how events played out. But to do this, we're actually going to back up, chronologically speaking, going back to a few years to when Transoxiana and Mogolistan were still united under the Chagatai Khanate. I know it's kind of confusing, we just spent the last 15 minutes talking about the western half, but bear with me, it's for the best, hopefully. But here we are, the year is 1343, and the Chagatai Khanate is still one political entity. Now, the tribal politics and inner workings that we just talked about are still definitely happening, but the Khanate is pre-split as of now. Anyways, going back to where we left off in the narrative, and also with the mistake corrections I told you about earlier, the year is 1343. The Chagatai Khanate is still united, and it is being ruled by a man named Kazan ibn Yasaur, or simply Kazan, Khan Kazan. Anyway, so this man, Kazan Khan, is actually the last Khan of the Chagatai Khanate before the fateful fracturing. He was the son of a prince named Yasaur, who had tried but failed to seize the Khanship years prior. But Kazan succeeded where his father had failed and seized the Khanship of the Chagatai Khanate by 1343. We know very little about Kazan's reign, but it was nonetheless an important one. What we do have, though, are several sources that don't view him too highly at all. One of our primary sources on Timur and the surrounding events of Timur's life, a book often called the Zafarnama, and we'll talk more about this sometime in the future, but this is how the Zafarnama describes Kazan. But this prince, being naturally inclined to tyranny, carried his violence and injustice to so great a length that the people were reduced to despair. His tyranny had so far intimidated everyone that when he sent his orders to the princes, they had little thought of returning with their lives and commonly made their wills before they went. That kind of sounds like a violent dictator to me. But I have to say that medieval sources are almost always biased. In fact, I'll just say they're always biased, and usually very biased. I studied for a time at Oxford over in the Great Britain, and one of my courses was on the Holy Roman Empire's history during the medieval era, and my tutor, this wonderful, tiny, quaint Welshman, told me at the very beginning of the course, he said, and I'm not going to do a Welsh accent, but he said, "James, whenever you're reading anything, but especially primary sources from the medieval or ancient world, you have to have this one question constantly on rotation in your brain, and that question is, why is this lying bastard lying to me?" So was Kazan actually killing his own princes left and right? Maybe. It's certainly a strong possibility, but we really have no way to know for sure. And this source we're using, the Zafarnama, it was written by a guy who very well may have benefited politically by portraying Khan Kazan in the worst of lights. What we can put together, though, is that Kazan wanted to centralize his rule. He knew what we know, that these many tribes within his Khanate are the real sources of power. And if he doesn't hold on to them with an iron grip, then he really isn't in control. So very soon after taking power, Kazan began to exhibit more authority over the local tribes. And as you can imagine, this didn't go over so well with these tribes. They were okay with having a Khan, I guess, but certainly not what they deemed a tyrant. And now they viewed Kazan as just that. So just as we've seen about 1 billion times now, a rebellion broke out in answer to the overreaching Khan. The rebellion was organized, it had support from many of the chief tribes and tribal families, and the leader of this rebellion was a local prince, a man named Kazagan. Which is great, isn't it? So now we have an Amir Kazagan of the Karaunis tribe, leading the revolt against the Khan Kazan. Kazagan versus Kazan. Well, Kazan organizes his forces and supporters, the rebels organize their side, and in the year 1345, the two forces met in battle. Here's what the Zafarnama says. And when the Khan got to a narrow passage named Kaluga, or the Iron Gate, the two armies met and fought in a plain. The battle was unfortunate to the Confederate princes, for Amir Kazagan, their leader, was wounded by an arrow in his right eye, shot by Kazan himself. And so the rebels were scattered, and their leader, now partially blind, fled. Khan Kazan had crushed the rebellion, and there was celebrating all around. But then he made a mistake. He hadn't actually killed Kazagan, the figurehead of the whole revolt movement. And with winter on its way, and winters in Central Asia can be absolutely brutal, Kazan retired back to his city and bunkered down to survive the cold. The winter of 1345 was apparently so cold that the horses of the cavalrymen froze to death where they were standing, and the cattle herds were devastated. Many of Kazan's men died or just deserted him because it was all just falling apart so fast. And this meant that Kazan's army was obviously weakened quite a bit. And guess who's very interested in this fact? Yeah, it's Kazagan, who has been busy getting his boys back together, tending to wounds, presumably looking quite dashing in an eye patch, gathering resources, and now wanting a round 2 battle. And maybe Khan Kazan knew that giving battle with this state of his army was a terrible idea, but here's the thing, the tribes are watching your every move. If they sense 1 ounce of weakness, 1 moment of trepidation, they'll pounce, and you'll be out of a job or dead. And so, the two men, the Khan and the rebel, the two armies, they meet in a second battle. And we don't know the details of the battle, but we do know what happens. The rebels were victorious, the Khan's army was routed, and Khan Kazan himself was killed in the onslaught. This was in the year 1346 or 1347, and this marks the end of the United Chagatai Khanate. For with the death of the Khan, there was no sufficient man to take his place. The eastern half, Mogulistan, was full of tribes with aspirations of their own, and so the east broke off. And Kazagan, who now found himself somewhat in charge of things, was content with letting Mogulistan go. He was not the new Khan, and he didn't really have a great claim to it, but he was content with continuing to call himself as Amir Kazagan, that is, the Prince Kazagan, and so Mogulistan broke away to follow its own path, and we'll head there next week to see what they do over there. But for now, Transoxiana was under the control of its new leader, Amir Kazagan. Sort of. Because many of the tribes saw this as the perfect time to really start building up their autonomy. After all, there's no Khan anymore, just some Amir. And further, Amir Kazagan seems to have been sort of fine with letting everybody do their own thing. The Zafarnama speaks of him very highly, saying this: the new Khan, not a Khan, just an Amir, but go on. The new Khan rendered himself so much more agreeable to all the people by his justice and liberality. And a bit later it goes on to say, he acquitted with so much prudence and equity and remedying the public disorders that his name deserves to be immortalized in history. Now that's a pretty good description to have. Way to go, Kazagan. But this is where we will leave the broad narrative for now. The year is 1347, the Chagatai Khanate has split, the western portion, Transoxiana, or Mawarnar, is a loose confederation of tribes led by a man named Amir Kazagan, who seems to be getting on fairly well with the people, and we will see what happens here in our next episode. But for now, we have to switch gears, because we have finally arrived. The date is April 9th, or perhaps April 8th, but we'll go with April 9th. April 9th, 1336. Near the city of Kesh, roughly 50 miles from the city of Samarkand, a baby was born. 62 years from now, this baby lying before us will be leading a vast and elite army into the city of Delhi, sacking one of the greatest cities in the world at the time, and driving Muslim and Hindu alike to flee into the mountains and jungles to avoid his wrath. 66 years ahead, this baby will not just defeat, but crush one of the greatest rulers of the age into submission, plunging the mighty Ottoman Empire into complete anarchy. 68 years from now, this baby will be entertaining ambassadors and diplomats from the most powerful realms on the earth and referring to their kings as my children or my servants, and nobody will dare to say otherwise or to correct him. This man will be called the Great Emir, the Sword of Islam, the Master of Heavenly Conjunctions, the Destroyer of Worlds, and the true heir of Genghis Khan. But already, we've run into a problem. Here is where things are going to start getting tricky. So far, everything we've covered in this podcast has been more or less accepted as fact, more or less objective. But it may come to no surprise to you that Timur's life was very controversial, and like many controversial historical figures, Timur is still a very controversial person. Now, it's one thing to disagree about somebody's effectiveness as a ruler or commander, or even the personal ethics of anybody, but it's difficult to take any side of those issues if we can't even agree on the sources. Because the good news with Timur is that for the time, we actually have a pretty decent amount of primary sources on the guy, and his exploits, and his enemies, and his story, and such. The bad news is that A, some of these sources might actually be propaganda created hundreds of years after Timur's death, and B, almost every single source is either 110% behind Timur or 110% against him. So things get pretty complicated and pretty controversial pretty quick. Now, what I'm going to try and do now and for the future is balance these all out to try and find a Timur that is the most accurate to history. But sometimes balance is just impossible, and his birthday is one of those issues. April 8th or April 9th, 1336, has long been the date historians and even Timur's contemporaries agreed upon. And on top of this, several of Timur's descendants, who had inherited some degree of authority because of Timur, later verified that yes, this was his birthday. That is when he was born. And don't get me wrong, many of the sources do tend to land on this date. And even recent historians, personally in an unbiased position in relation to Timur's dynasty, even they have accepted this date. But recently, and we're talking very recently, like within the last 2 decades or so, a new opinion has started to arise. And this new opinion has been primarily spearheaded by the historian Beatrice Mans, or Mons, I'm not sure, and she points out that there are a few very funny things about the year 1336. First of all, 1336 is only 1 year after the collapse of the Ilkhanate. And here's a spoiler. Timur is going to conquer pretty much all of the land that was formerly part of the Ilkhanate later in his life. So could his birthday be used as kind of saying that he is sort of this spiritual successor to the Mongol leadership of the Middle East? Could be. And in addition, many of Timur's descendants are going to get really into astronomy, quite famously so actually. And I believe it was Timur's grandson or great-grandson who pointed out that April 9th, 1336, that was a day in which several stars and planets aligned in the heavens. And as it is with so many cultural and religious traditions, alignment in the heavens often coincides with a special birth. So could this date be a lie in order to spread propaganda that Timur's birth was mandated by the heavenly realm? Could be. And here's where things get even shadier. So here's a question. Theoretically speaking, what would be the best source possibly for any historical figure to have? Well, it's pretty hard to beat having an autobiography, an account that lets us actually get inside that person's head. And guess what? Timur has an autobiography, it's an invaluable and incredible piece of history. But here's the catch. No other source that was a contemporary of Timur ever mentions the autobiography or Timur keeping any sort of personal journal. Further, no source in the next few centuries after Timur mentions it either. Now, I've been calling it his autobiography, but the source is actually referred to as 2 different sources, the Institutes and the Memoirs. Either way, sometimes they're lumped together as Timur's autobiography. Neither of these sources appear in history until 232 years after Timur. And it's at this time that a Persian scholar discovers them and shows them to the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in the year 1637. And Shah Jahan just happens to be a direct descendant of Timur, and therefore maybe this was all just a propaganda stunt to legitimize his reign and make Timur, his ancestor, seem like a pretty great guy. Therefore, for all of these reasons, the memoirs and the institutes have fallen out of favor within the Timur historical circles. Nevertheless, though, in some places, these sources are still accepted as the actual autobiographical works of Timur. In fact, up until very recently, I believe, the state of Uzbekistan had an official statement validating the authenticity of the autobiography. Regardless of whether the autobiography is real or made up years later, we will be using it. It is valuable to us either way. But all that to say, Timur's actual birthday is sort of up for grabs. I will use the day April 9th, 1336, because it's sort of tradition now. Do I believe it's his actual birthday? Probably not, but we don't really have a substitute date, and it's all up for grabs anyway, so this is what we're going with. Now, as far as the other details about his birth go, again, it's kind of all up in the air. I won't go as far to say that Timur was a nobody, but he was almost a nobody, and there certainly weren't any scribes writing about his birth from day one. It wouldn't be decades later until anybody would even notice Timur, never mind write down the details of his life. And by then, pretty much every source we do have is either confidently in the pro-Timur camp or the anti-Timur camp, meaning that the source material is going to be biased on top of being based on hearsay. And we will dissect all of the sources on Timur's life in the future. And trust me, that may sound boring, but I assure you it will not be, because every single author who writes about Timur has their own crazy, incredible stories. But anyway, here is what the writer and traveler Ahmad ibn Arab Shah wrote about Timur's birth. Try and figure out whether or not Arab Shah is in the pro-Timur or anti-Timur camp. The birthplace of this deceiver was a village of a lord named Ilgar in the territory of Kesh. May Allah remove him from the garden of paradise. He and his father were shepherds belonging to a mixed horde, lacking either reason or religion. So yeah, definitely in the anti-Timur camp, and this is why I love Arab Shah, and we'll be referring to him a lot, but he hates Timur so much and just is not afraid to tell you about it. It is also Arab Shah who gives the wonderful legend that I began this episode with. When Timur is born, this helmet appears in the sky, it floats there, and then it comes crashing down onto the earth below, throwing sand and flame all around it. Did this happen? Probably not. But I like the imagery here and how foreboding it is to the entire story of Timur. And yes, it is this story that I based the cover art off of. So that's kind of cool. Another source, written by an Armenian man named Tovma Metsobetsi, said of Timur's birth that he was the precursor of the Antichrist, who appeared in the East, merciless, cruel, treacherous, filled with all the evil, impurity, and strategies of the tempter Satan. So, not too helpful for us who are just trying to get some details on the guy's birth, and definitely another source we can safely put in the anti-Timur group. The Zafarnama, which we talked about earlier, that's a source that is certainly pro-Timur, but it doesn't even mention Timur's birth. Timur just sort of appears in the narrative when he's already a young man. Similarly, even Timur's autobiography, and maybe I'm wrong, to be honest, I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet because it's about 4 million pages long, but so far I haven't come across any mention of his own birth. He talks about his childhood, but the earliest story I could find was Timur telling the story of how he was named. According to Timur himself, and again, take this with a hefty grain of salt, but according to Timur, he was named when his parents took him to see a holy man, and upon arriving they found this man reading aloud from the Holy Quran, specifically a verse that read this: "Are you sure that he who dwelleth in heaven will not cause the earth to swallow you up, and behold, it will shake?" And apparently the verb will shake can be translated as Tamaru or Timur. And thus the holy man told Timur's parents that his name will be Timur. But of course, the name Timur was a very popular name among Turkish and Mongolian peoples of the area for decades now. We've talked about quite a few other Timurs, and we'll certainly meet a few more. It's one of the most confusing things about this whole thing. But, for whatever reason, he was named Timur, and this name translates to iron or of iron. So we may not know the actual play-by-play of Timur's birth or when it exactly was, but here is what we do know. Timur was born into the Barlas clan, which, if you remember from earlier, was one of the 4 older tribes that had been here since Genghis Khan's initial invasion. The Barlas clan had been given land here in payment, and they had stayed here ever since. Geographically, Timur was born near the city of Kesh, roughly 50 miles south or southeast from Samarkand. Timur's father was a man by the name of Targai, and Targai is somewhat of a mysterious figure. Targai was probably some sort of important figure in the Barlas tribe. Now, what that means and just how important, though, is a matter of controversy. One source says that Targai controlled 10,000 horses. Arab Shah says that Targai was a simple shepherd or a blacksmith, and Timur himself describes how Targai gave up his political life in order to pursue a religious life that rejected the physical world. And then, of course, you have historian Beatrice Mans, who thinks Targai was probably actually a pretty important dude, but his importance was later downplayed by Timur just to make his rise to power seem that more awesome and inspiring. Balancing this all out, though, Targai was probably a minor noble within the tribe with some wealth and some amount of animals to take care of. When Targai died in 1360 years later, Timur headed back home to take care of the estate, perhaps implying that there was a certain amount of wealth there. But that being said, Targai was not the leader of the Barlas tribe, and it also seems that he didn't really want to be. Timur's mother, named Takina, is even a greater mystery. Several sources name her, but don't give much more information except that Timur loved her and that she was possibly of lowly origin, while other sources claim that she was a descendant from Genghis Khan or various Persian rulers. Now, this may not seem like it matters too much, but it does, because and we're jumping here quite a bit, but in order for Timur to later actually have some sort of legitimacy as ruler in this region, he has to overcome 2 rather giant hurdles. First of all, most of these lands still use the Mongolian system of rule, meaning if you want to fit in there, you must have some sort of ancestor link to Genghis Khan. But secondly, most of this land is now Muslim, meaning that if you want to rule, you must have some sort of divine link within the Islamic faith. And we will, of course, get into this much more, but for now, let's zoom back into Timur's early life. His parents are perhaps better off than most, but certainly not the rulers of the tribe. Never mind all of Transoxiana, never mind anything near resembling what Timur's empire would later entail. I'm reading historian Harold Lamb's account of Timur's life, and it's a fun book if you're looking for a good read, but Lamb points out that Alexander the Great inherited a kingdom, and more importantly, a fantastic and professional army that his father King Philip had created. Yes, Alexander created an empire, but it was his father who set it up for him. Genghis Khan had his troubles certainly early on, but his father was one of the leaders of an entire tribe. His name bore weight. Timur doesn't have this luxury. His family might be somebodies, but he has no army, no empire, no great wealth. And in fact, it seems that there may have been even some level of poverty involved with Timur's early life, because early on with his life, he is actually injured. The stories and details differ, and we'll talk about this more later, but he was permanently injured to the point that this is what earned him the title Timur the Lame, because he would forever walk with a limp after this event. Now, the 2 most common stories are that he was either injured while working as a mercenary or shot by an arrow by a shepherd whose sheep Timur was trying to steal. Either way, it almost doesn't really matter. Timur was trying to make a living away from home, and maybe that implies that there was some sort of poverty back home. As for Timur's early childhood, though, again, we don't have too much to work with. His autobiography source says that at 7 years of age, he started attending school, and at age 9, he learned how to assist with services at the local mosque. Is this what happened? Possibly. It certainly makes Timur look good, but if the Barlas tribe was a nomadic sheep-herding people, then was this growing up and going to school a later invention? Wouldn't he be out helping the sheep herders? Nevertheless, there is a story from Timur's biography that I just love, and even if it's not true, I can definitely picture a similar scene playing out. So in this story, Timur is talking here about what he and his classmates did upon being let out of school, and he says, "When we came out from school, we began to play as children, but I, assuming the command, stood upon the high mound, and having divided them into 2 armies, caused them to fight a sham battle. And when I saw one of the parties worsted, I sent them assistance." So he's already playing war and commanding his friends around and moving reinforcements. I find this believable. I did this when I was a boy of 12 or 14 or however young Timur was here. I can see little Timur and his friends running around the steppe or swimming on the banks of the river, playing war, hitting one another with sticks, chasing each other around. And also, we do know that Timur was raised in the traditional steppe way. That is, maybe he didn't go to school or attend services at a mosque, we don't know, but he certainly learned how to ride a horse, certainly learned how to shoot a bow, and certainly learned how to hunt. And Timur would use all of this knowledge for the rest of his life. But I'm sort of at 8,000 words right now, and the next part of the story, when Timur actually emerges into verifiable history, that's where things really start to take off. But instead of thinking of Timur as the brutal conqueror that he will become, as a man who will construct giant pyramids of human skulls and bury prisoners of war alive, today, just picture a small baby, crying as he breathes his first gasps of air, cradled by a mother looking down with nothing but love, and behind her, a father beaming with pride. Life on the steppe is brutal, the winters are harsh, the dangers many, but here are 2 people smiling as they bring a new life into the world. And Targai and Takina would only grow more proud of their son as they watched him take his first steps, learn to ride a horse, and run around with his friends, shouting with laughter, playing all the sorts of games that children play. Nobody could know that this little scrappy boy, sunburnt, covered in dirt, but full of energy, would change the entire course of history forever. Now, before we wrap things up, I do feel like I owe you a bit of an update and an apology. If you've been following the show, then you know the last few weeks have been a bit rough for me. In addition to just the utter chaos our world is in right now, I ran into some personal problems like insurance issues, job issues, some good old family drama, some depression, and without going into the details, I had a dramatic increase of panic attacks. At one point, I collapsed in a store and had to be helped back up because of the stress and crap and life and all that fun stuff. Things aren't fixed yet, but I am in a better place and hopefully things will continue to improve. However, this does mean something for the future of this show. It has always been and is still my desire to release episodes every week on Thursday morning, and that just hasn't happened. And unfortunately, in the foreseeable future, I just don't see that happening. Now, I'm going to do my best to stick to this schedule as it is something I would like to obtain, but just don't be surprised if it doesn't play out that way. I've made quite a few promises on deadlines, and very few of them have turned out. So I've just decided to stop promising you when the next episode will be out. It sucks, I hate doing this, but it's just kind of where I am right now. If you did reach out to me with encouragement and understanding, thank you, I really appreciate that. Everyone seems to be on board, and I've received a lot of really nice notes and encouragement. So thank you for that. Thank you for being on board with me and the show. We will get to the point where I can finally release every week, hopefully soon, but I'm not going to tell you when because I don't know. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Timur Podcast. Next week, we will take a look at what happens next with Emir Kazagan in Transoxiana, whether or not Mogulistan over in the east will ever enter back into the narrative, and how Timur bursts into the written records of history. If you want to follow the show or reach out to me for any reason, the Timur Podcast can be found on Twitter at PodcastTimur, on Facebook at TimurPod. You can email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com, or check out the show's website at timurpodcast.com. And speaking of timurpodcast.com, I actually just finally updated it, so you can find a nice maps page with a few maps that I may refer to in the future, and I'll be adding to it. And then I'm also creating a Who's Who page with every historical figure I've ever mentioned on the show thus far. That'll be obviously a work in progress, but I'll try to keep it updated because if you ever forget a name I throw around, and I throw around a lot of random names, that might be a good place to check in just to see who's who. Anyway, thanks again for taking the time to listen. Next episode, we will take a look at the next chapter of the story of Tamerlane, right here on the Timur Podcast.